Welcome back. Wanted to change things up a little bit today, refocusing our attention on the Tokugawa era in Japan, specifically looking at the maturation of that system and also kind of forecasting the problems leading to its decline in the first part of the 19th century. So today we're basically going to look at the what's known as the Genroku period, towards the latter part of the 17th, early 18th century, but give a kind of a full account of exactly what is happening to the Tokugawa system over the course of basically the mid 17th up through the much of the 18th century as a whole. So we're going to look at the transitions, the continuing pressures and transitions that are taking place in the mid to late Tokugawa era, the which is going to bring about with the implementation of the Tokugawa system. You're going to have a period of prolonged stability and economic growth taking place as a result of that kind of secure political system. And the rise of a merchant and finance class that is going to become increasingly affluent and wealthy. But as a result of that very event, the economic development of the country and its growing sophistication, this is going to bring about new social problems and pressures that the Tokugawa system was poorly designed to handle and really negotiate. So, in a larger kind of respect here, what you have is the Tokugawa system becomes a victim of its own success in many respects. And so we're going to take a specific kind of a deep dive as to exactly why and how that happened here. The social changes that we're talking about, as I mentioned, are going to occur and be best represented by what's called the Genroku period, which is roughly from the late 17th and early 18th century. So, from specifically, historians refer to this time frame from 1688 to about 1704. So, it's about a 25-year span or so. I believe, or 20. More generally, if you wanted to kind of expand that a bit, it would include from about 1680 to about 1730, so more of like a 50-year span in which the influence of these kind of a Genroku kind of change in social practices and cultural practices are beginning to take place. This is where we have, again, this rapid, and a 50-year time span is quite short. It's almost immediate in the historical kind of context that we're talking about here. You have this rapid implementation of cultural growth and change taking place, which is going to lead to the, like I said, this more sophisticated kind of structure within Japan itself. We alluded to this earlier, talking about from the last lecture, talking about the implementation of the Tokugawa era, focusing on things like the kabuki theater, haiku poetry, and literature in general, specifically the use of the novel and its tremendous kind of growth in popularity and its readership. In all three of these cultural examples, what you have is each of them reflecting more popular culture. That is where these types of media are focusing on the daily life, the everyday life of common Japanese members of the society as a whole. And that there is a greater emphasis on kind of a seize the day type of attitude, focusing on individual pleasure and immediate gratification. And this is again occurring within the commoner's rank, the base of the social ladder, and the most populated ladder within Japanese society. This is includes peasants, but also what you might begin to identify as a growing or emerging middle class. Whenever talking about the middle class, specifically with regard to maybe non-Western cultures, it's a bit difficult it's always kind of use that term gingerly because it could be implied as kind of a Western type of bias, perhaps. But what's happening is that there is a large amount of social and economic change and flux that's beginning to happen during this period, and that's really what is being emphasized here. This idea of focusing on immediate gratification and personal, like individual pressure, is also a significant reaction against, or even a defection from more Confucianist or traditional types of teachings, which we'll touch upon in a few minutes here. So we're going to look at the catalysts, the characteristics of the Roku period, and also the efforts by the government, by the Tokugawa family and order to try and respond to these changes and developments. Really, by the late to mid 18th century, Japan is suffering from a political system, as a spoiler alert here, that is struggling to keep pace with the pace with these developments. It was, because of its own rigidity, its own kind of feudal-like structure, the amount of social change, economic change, and cultural change is just going to overwhelm the system, which we'll get more into when we focus our attention after this lecture. Focus our attention on what's known as the Meiji Restoration in the mid to latter part of the 19th century in Japan. Beginning with the economic and financial kind of aspects of this era of reform or kind of evolution, you might say. Again, we have the merchant class being broadly represented across social ranks and sectors. So that is to say that you might have a merchant class that includes the very wealthy who have maybe expansive kind of commercial empires, a family that might be in control of several commercial houses. They might have interests across several provinces in Japan during this period of time, but also you might have merchants that are more, kind of independent shop owners or even small-time peddlers. So the term merchant is a kind of an umbrella-like term here, but obviously the most influential are going to be those with the resources, and by that I mean the commercial, the monetary resources in order to apply and drive change in a kind of a socio-economic way. One of the most influential of those was the rise of financiers in the city of Osaka in Tokugawa, Japan. They built expansive merchant houses, tapping into various sectors of the economy, an economy that was becoming more diversified throughout the 17th century. They were going to cater to the daimyo class, these feudal lords, again, as their commitments to organizing and governing a province, in addition to fulfilling their obligations to the Tokugawa order, the family itself, and also kind of the feudal-like patronage that they needed to maintain. Uh, this meant that they needed increasingly large sums of money in order to support lavish lifestyles and also spiraling entertainment expenses as well. Because of things like the alternate attendance policy, they're having to spend part of the year in their province, but also then relocate to the capital city of Edo to be in the Tokugawa's good graces and physical presence during part of the year. This meant that travel and the shipment of goods and the movement of households, the maintaining of two separate estates, properties, staff, was becoming increasingly untenable as far as that economics was concerned. It also, in a financial sense, is going to drive the need for a money economy and also the establishment and extension of a credit economy as well. So within the Tokugawa coming into existence by the beginning of the 17th century, and here we are talking about the latter part of the 17th century, within a century you have the implementation of a feudal system state, and by the close of that same century you're talking about a financial sector that is sophisticated to the point of extending credit and developing lines of credit for the upper echelons of the political members of the political order to maintain their lifestyle and their kind of public obligations. That kind of development is extreme. That is the exception and not the norm. I mean, if you compare it to someplace like the European experience, you're talking about centuries. And here we are talking about within 1 century, a very highly sophisticated and complex economic system coming online. That is one example of the type of change that the Tokugawa family and again the central pillar of this kind of military political order is having to try and adjust to or keep pace with. Again, economic sectors that are beginning to emerge as a result of all this that's going on are things like the entertainment sector, travel, kind of covered those, shipping, as well as credit. So right there are 4 key aspects of economic growth that did not really exist in any substantial form at the beginning of the Tokugawa system. So these houses, the Osaka financiers, as a chief example, are beginning to profit from this increased economic sophistication. They're going to begin to extend long-term loans to these daimyo, but apply to those loans quite high interest rates in order to see a return on investment, and a lucrative one at that. By 1670, the formation of this Osaka banking system came to dominate not only the Osaka region itself, but also all of the major trading centers across Japan. So this network is becoming almost kind of integral and web-like in its effect and the type of influence it's going to be able to exert across the central and southern Japan that was under Tokugawa influence and dominance at this time. And because of the importance of this new banking system, these financiers attain themselves a high degree of influence, so much so that they're given kind of a quasi-samurai-like status in the within the social ranks. This included stipends that were equivalent to minor daimyo in some cases. So the state is helping to basically support and fund these financiers, and providing them with a kind of leverage. They were also provided with monopolistic privileges as well. This is again done to ensure things like price stabilization. So the financiers would basically agree to, you know, a market price for providing services. They would provide also proper and adequate distribution of goods throughout the Tokugawa region, and they would abide by proper payment and accounting procedures as well. So in many cases, these financiers are governing and overseeing their own functions, and that they are being basically the state is saying, hey, look, you know, you have keys to the car in this kind of metaphor. You know, you know, drive safely, essentially. So there are going to be, however, and as you might expect, side effects as a result of all of this. Again, it's an early example of Japan's social order beginning to butt up against the limitations of the Tokugawa system and its sense of imposing order. Merchants, which at the beginning of the Tokugawa system had been frowned upon, had been, you know, kind of just discarded as contemptuous, were now the key players within the whole network, really, the whole commercial and economic engine of the Tokugawa system. And combined with this, the key members of the political order under the Tokugawa system were increasingly dependent upon this merchant class for financial solvency, and for supporting the functions of state. And these circumstances are going to help trigger what's known as the Genroku period. The Genroku period, as itself, was again this kind of cultural embrace of pleasure, the pursuit of a pleasurable and comfortable lifestyle, which focused on key outlets and quarters within everyday society. This included places like tea houses, bathhouses, theaters, and this was virtually throughout the country, throughout the Tokugawa state, in places like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto. These major urban centers that were beginning to be the focal point of commerce and politics and these social kinds of pressures, and also kind of cultural expressions characteristic within the Genroku period. This was not obviously in keeping with the traditional Tokugawa social structure. In fact, it's going to refute it in many instances. The Genroku period was again initiated, driven by popular culture. Okay, so this is not something that's coming from the elite. It's coming from, you know, the non-elite, the commoners, common class, that were exerting their own sense and kind of imposing their own sense of cultural identity, you might say, at the very least a sense of cultural importance, for the very first time really in Japanese history. So this is upsetting, disorienting to traditional cultural norms and practices. Again, I mentioned that there was this contraction away from Confucian teachings, the abandonment in many respects of those teachings, that you place pleasure, personal fulfillment over disciplined moral ethics. Okay, um, uh, the Tokugawa Bakufu, that is the term essentially used for the central institution of the central government itself, and it's heavily based on a feudal like structure, hierarchical, but also embedded within it are this kind of is this militarist kind of characteristic to it, so that the head of the Tokugawa family is basically has this kind of like pyramid scheme as far as power structure and the allocation of power down to the lowest levels of the daimyo, as we talked about previously, and as many of you kind of correctly scoped out in your exam responses on our first exam, when you were IDing that term of the Tokugawa era, or the early era that we'd studied up to this point. So it's autocratic in its orientation, and it's going to try and obviously curtail the Genroku expressions, and this was mainly done through censorship. And one of the best examples of this comes about in the early 18th century, when playwrights and other kind of cultural figures begin to try and get around this type of state-sponsored censorship. One of the best examples occurs when Chikamatsu Manzeman, who was a Japanese playwright, he lives from about 1653 to 1725. During his lifetime, during his ascendance as a cultural figure, an icon in Japan during this period, he's going to write an entertaining satirical work that's going to poke fun at, criticize the sitting Tokugawa ruler, Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi. He was the fifth shogun of the era. He was also known as the Dog Shogun. This is because Tsuneyoshi enacted legislation protecting the canine family, the family of dogs, essentially. There was a census taken of dogs within the country, throughout the countryside. There was a taxation imposed on dogs, or fees that were meant to support canines. There was a dog commissioner and physicians that were specially trained to cater to the needs of these animals. And there was also the creation of public kennels to house and support these animals again throughout the countryside. So you have this kind of these state funds going to support this kind of obsession maybe with these creatures. No disrespect to dog lovers, just a little bit odd, you might say, to have the head of state take such an interest and go to such measures to ensure their well-being. Nonetheless, this is what began to occur, and Chikamatsu here is going to see an opportunity to criticize this as he saw fit. In 1714, Chikamatsu was going to write this satirical piece making fun of Tsuneyoshi and his administration of these policies, his enactment of these policies. But what he does in order to get around the censors in place that were designed to protect the Tokugawa family and Tsuneyoshi against such public criticism. In order to get around that, Chikamatsu set his story in an earlier period in order to um, evade those that censorship that was in place. So he basically is not going to identify Tsuneyoshi explicitly, but basically use contemporary the contemporary status quo as take it and remove it to an era where it was, the members of society at large could simply say, okay, well, Chikamatsu is basically criticizing the existence of this, you know, of this reality, but by putting it into a previous context, a historical context, but we know that he's actually making a social commentary on contemporary life. And that was pretty commonplace. I mean, you're going to see examples of this, strong parallels of this, when we get to talking about the Enlightenment in Europe and how and why it is often in France where the roots of the Enlightenment era begin to sprout. That's, you might say, well, that's a bit ironic in that France is an autocratic state, much like the Tokugawa system here in Japan, but you're going to see oftentimes, time and again, that type of paradox repeat itself, where in the most kind of autocratic or repressive regimes, you have these expressions of critique and criticism beginning to emerge, and they do so in these more creative ways in order to not be victims of crackdowns or getting around censorship, as the case was here with Chikamatsu. It's also interesting that basically this Genroku period is happening just about the same time as the Enlightenment era is beginning to get a foothold in Europe as well. So you might say that this is kind of a common characteristic that is beginning to kind of gain traction, various kind of really disconnected parts of the world, but nonetheless there are very kind of common reaction to the this action reaction type of paradigm that's beginning to take place. The imposition of order and the frustrations that are beginning to emerge as a result of that in both of these two separate instances. There'll be much more attention paid to we studied basically in the previous lecture studied the implementation of kind of a more autocratic, the absolute kind of forms of power that the French state was beginning to impose. Talking about the Enlightenment, we'll see how France and other sectors of Europe are beginning to react to those types of institutions. For us here, however, with the Genroku period, this, again, kind of shows this questionable temperament of autocratic rulers as well. This tendency to have these policies being put in place that really are, for members of the rank and file members of society, are kind of head scratching as far as what is the state doing, and why is it focusing so much attention on these kinds of matters that are not really in the direct interests of the of the what the people think the state should be interested in. There are also going to be continued persistent economic problems that begin to plague the Tokugawa order and members within it, the ranks within it. The expenditures continue to rise throughout this mid to late Tokugawa era, resulting from things like, again, extravagance, the daimyo trying to live beyond their means. There's going to be inefficient kind of bookkeeping within these daimyo families, and keeping track of their own expenses. There's going to be corruption as well, which is going to undermine the kind of political order. And there's also, because of the complexity of society that's taking place in Japan during this period of time, and specifically we're talking about increased urbanization. People are beginning to gravitate towards urban centers. That meant that there are going to be a new series of social needs that the state is going to have to try and address and provide for and rectify. That kind of complexity was not able to be met by the existing order. This was compounded by the fact that there was an antiquated tax code that was in place and remained in place for far too long, and was not updated as it should have been. So this the public fundraising through taxation that took place could not literally provide the funds needed to address the growing sectors of Japan's economy. Commerce was the fastest growing sector, but the tax code was not designed and it was not reformed in a way that would uniformly and consistently tax commerce in a way that the state could raise funds off of this rise of this new economic activity. Okay, and so it is again another example here of just how literally overwhelmed the Tokugawa system becomes, and how quickly this happens. To pile on here, there are also going to be social and political problems that quickly emerge. The Tokugawa state began to crumble, and it began to be so that they could not pay the warriors' stipends. This is basically money that's going to the samurai that were employed by not only the Tokugawa family but also the numerous daimyo across the various provinces. These stipends that the samurai lived off of began to be cut, and they began to be cut rather drastically. By the year 1800, their stipends had been cut by as much as 50%. Again, the state is not bringing in the money it needs to. The demands being put on the state to provide public funds for various services meant that the same amount of money was now being demanded by a growing number of issues. In order to compensate for all that, they begin to take money away from the samurai class in order to reallocate funds to other sectors that needed it. So as a result, some daimyo and samurai begin to go into debt. They simply cannot keep up with their income cannot keep up with the expenses that they're maintained to or required to maintain. In some cases, the Tokugawa system again was becoming, as I mentioned at the outset, a victim of its own success here. That political stability, prolonged stability, led to economic prosperity, which is going to erode the foundations of this very rigid social military Tokugawa system, and it just simply became obsolete. The daimyo and samurai began, as a result, to question their own sense of loyalty. What is it that we're doing? Why are we participating in the functions of state that is not, serving, that is not supporting us in our ability to do so, essentially. And so, as a result, morale within the public service sector just plummets, and this happens throughout the Genroku period. Poor samurai begin to resort to some rather desperate measures in order to keep their own expenses in check. These included things like pawning the ceremonial family armor that had been passed down through generations within samurai family in order to raise money to maintain a household. They practiced more drastic measures like that of infanticide, the killing of their own children in order to reduce economic liabilities and expenses, household expenses again. Some simply turned to abandoning their feudal duties. They, instead of trying to live as a higher ranking member within the Tokugawa society, they simply gave up their status and lived as commoners, moving down the social ladder in order to improve their own standard of living, which is again kind of this paradoxical flip. That you there's no better way of reducing your financial obligations than putting yourself in a lower social class, living more modestly. So you can see that there are directions here that are being taken that are not necessarily going to be sustainable or even desirable within much of the social order within this time period here. There was a tremendous amount of resentment that was beginning to accumulate within the ranks of the poorer samurai, resentment that they felt towards the merchants that were living in sustained comfort. This supposed class that was beneath feudal lords in the eyes of the Tokugawa order at its early implementation, was not reflected in the reality here at the turn of the 17th into the 18th century and beyond. There's also the introduction of a new emerging social class, the Gono, which is kind of a wealthy peasant class. This is what I alluded to as kind of you might begin to consider it as a middle class in some respects. Certainly it is again another example of the social fluidity that Japan is undergoing here. They emerge, this Gono class is going to emerge during this Genroku period, and it's yet another adjustment for the Tokugawa system to have to deal with. But again, this class had not been, it did not exist when the Tokugawa system came online, and so and there was no way to accommodate it within the rigid social structure. So the growing wealth of the commoners and the common class was now seen as a threat as well. On top of this, there were also other stresses that began to again just eviscerate the Tokugawa sense of order. Famines begin to occur nationwide. This happens in the 1720s, in the 1780s, and in the 1830s. And it's going to lead to numerous peasant revolts. What's interesting about these peasant revolts that happen periodically is that, and by periodically I mean that roughly during the 17th century they happened about, they peasant revolts averaged about 5 per year. During the 18th century, they averaged 12 per year, which on average is about once a month. So the peasant class, the largest social class within Japan, is becoming increasingly, frustrated, and kind of exercising that frustration in protest. They weren't necessarily upset at the famines that occurred, although people that are hungry are more likely to protest. They were also socially active and becoming more socially aware. They would protest against existing taxes and the existing tax code, so that this made it so that again, ironically, you have a tax code that is obsolete and is not functioning as it should because it has not been overhauled, and at the same time you have the population, the bulk of the population, criticizing and revolting against the existing tax code that is already underservicing the public sector. And so those two things are going to come into conflict as well. So this is going to really result in the shifting of sentiments, particularly among this samurai class. The ranks that were supported and had been employed in the service of daimyo across the various provinces, now they were becoming victims of social mobility that was occurring all around them, but that they themselves were becoming victims of because their status was plummeting, their social status. Amidst the slashing of financial obligations by daimyo family and within their ranks, samurai were becoming, they were just simply being unemployed and or marginalized in society. And so this professional warrior class was now idle, and where they had been in service of the state, where they had provided and thrived amidst a sense of loyalty to the daimyo that were employing them, in return for providing either administrative aid to the daimyo within their particular province or fiefdom, or providing security and protection to the daimyo and the family. Now that loyalty was just evaporated, and the samurai began to tie their sense of loyalty to the country itself. They began to look around. Began to see that there are all these problems plaguing Japan, and they began to see the country in jeopardy, and believe in that sense of jeopardy, and they take it upon themselves. They see themselves, this warrior class, the samurai, as the potential saviors for retrieving, basically saving Japan from this precipice, this kind of predicament, essentially. So this is this period of Japanese history here, where in many respects it does share certain parallels with what's happening in Europe, which I mentioned earlier about the kind of Enlightenment era. That would be taking place in Europe roughly about the same period of time. You have an autocratic system um, uh, trying to deal with this independent undercurrent of cultural expression and diversification. And what we'll see moving forward, after we get on the other side of talking about the American and French revolutions and the rest of the world during the 17th and 18th century, we'll come back to Japan to talk about the immediate factors contributing to what's known as the Meiji Restoration in 1868. We'll understand how that happens, the immediate kind of catalyst, and we'll also refocus attention on the importance of understanding this kind of rapid transition that we just covered here from a feudal existence and the feudal like structure to this more nationalist type of ideology that's beginning to attract a growing number of followers. So that's why I wanted to again just kind of get us out of the European focus for at least this lecture. Show some parallel developments that were taking place and some connections, parallel experiences, and I'll be focusing here on the Enlightenment to try and get us again towards the latter half of and through the 18th century, as far as European and North American kind of events that are taking place. But also I want to be sure to pick up threads in Africa, India, and also in South America, as well as we turn attention towards the 19th century, so that we're all kind of getting all parts of the world up to date as we begin to get into the 19th century. So appreciate your patience, and so that's kind of where things will stand here. Right? I'll talk to you soon.